In 1918, there were 1,200 hotels in Atlantic City, New Jersey. 1,200. A barrier island barely 10 miles long, most of it only 3 or 4 blocks wide, and it held more hotel rooms than cities 10 times its size. By 1970, you could roll a bowling ball down that same boardwalk in the height of summer and not hit anyone. That is not a metaphor. People who were there said it as a plain fact. Somewhere between those two moments, between the 1,200 hotels and the empty boardwalk, is a story about what happens when a city is built entirely on a single promise, that people will keep coming. The promise started with a doctor. Jonathan Pitney was a physician from Mendham, New Jersey, who rode horseback into the marshlands of southern New Jersey in 1819 and set up a medical practice in the little village of Absecon, on the mainland across the bay from a long, flat, mosquito-thick barrier island that the Lenni Lenape had called Absegami, Little Sea Water. The Lenape had summered there for generations. Nobody else much wanted it. Pitney looked at the salt air and the ocean breeze and saw something that, to him, was as obvious as a diagnosis. This island could cure people. The sea air, the bathing, the distance from the fetid, cholera-prone streets of Philadelphia. This was a health resort waiting to happen. All it needed was a way to get there. It took him more than a decade to convince anyone. He wrote letters to Philadelphia newspapers extolling the virtues of Absecon Beach, his proposed name for the settlement, as a health and summer retreat. Factory owners along the proposed rail route took interest, not because they believed in sea cures, but because a railroad through Camden County would serve their mills. In 1852, the New Jersey legislature approved a charter for the Camden and Atlantic Railroad. One railroad man reportedly called it a road to nowhere. The civil engineer who designed the city layout, Richard Osborne, a Philadelphian, gave it a more ambitious name. He called it Atlantic City. On July 1st, 1854, the first train pulled in, carrying newspapermen and dignitaries, on an island whose permanent population was somewhere around 250 souls. The city was incorporated on May 1st, 1854, carved from portions of Egg Harbor and Galloway townships. Pitney had built the railroad, lobbied for the Absecon Lighthouse after witnessing too many shipwrecks along what locals grimly called the Graveyard Inlet, and staked everything on the idea that salt water was medicine. He died in 1869, just before the thing he made became the thing it became. Some people talked about building a statue. They never did. What came next happened with an almost disorienting speed. By 1875, the population was 2,000. By 1900, it was 27,000, a 100-fold increase from that first trainload in 1854. A second railroad opened in 1878 because one line couldn't handle the demand. By the turn of the century, Atlantic City was drawing more than 100,000 visitors on peak summer weekends. The travel time from Philadelphia had dropped from 90 minutes to 50. The fare was cheap enough for a clerk or a seamstress. And what they found when they arrived was unlike anything else in America. The boardwalk came first. It was born from a mundane irritation, sand. Guests tracked it into hotel lobbies. It clogged the railroad cars. In 1870, a railroad conductor named Alexander Boardman and a hotel owner named Jacob Keim petitioned the city council for a solution. The city spent $5,000, half its tax revenue that year, to build a mile-long, 8-foot-wide wooden walkway, 1 foot above the sand. It was built in sections and dismantled every winter. It was the first boardwalk in the United States, possibly in the world. No commerce was allowed within 30 feet of it for the next decade. That restraint did not last. The boardwalk was rebuilt bigger in 1880, destroyed by a hurricane in 1889, rebuilt wider and higher, destroyed again, rebuilt again. By the 1890s, it stretched 4 miles, stood 10 feet above sea level, and had become the most famous promenade in America. Rolling chairs, wicker carriages pushed by attendants, appeared in 1884, and the boards were eventually laid in a herringbone pattern to give the chairs a smoother ride. The first amusement pier jutted out over the ocean in 1882. By 1898, Steel Pier opened with Annie Oakley as its star attraction, and would eventually earn the title, the showplace of the nation. presenting everything from boxing matches to a horse that dove from a 40-foot platform into a pool. But the real architecture of Atlantic City's golden age was vertical, not horizontal. The grand hotels. They rose along the boardwalk in waves, each one grander and more absurd than the last, financed by Philadelphians who understood that on this narrow island, oceanfront footage was the scarcest commodity on earth. The lots were long and narrow, the buildings shaped to maximize the number of rooms with an ocean view. In 1888, there were already over 500 hotels and boarding houses. The early ones were wooden, with scroll-sawed porches stacked story upon story, like wedding cakes made of lumber. Frank Furness, the great Philadelphia architect, put Moorish minarets on the Windsor Hotel. Stephen Button gave the early Traymore its French mansards. Then came concrete. In 1902, a great fire burned many of Atlantic City's wooden hotels, and fireproof construction became imperative. Josiah White III, a Quaker hotelier, had built the Queen Anne-style Marlborough House near Ohio Avenue in 1903. When he decided to expand, he hired the Philadelphia firm of Price and McClanahan, and they did something that made architects across the country pay attention. They built the Blenheim Hotel entirely from reinforced concrete, one of the first major buildings in America to use the material. The 1905 threat of a steel strike made it practical. The fact that pouring concrete was quieter than riveting steel made it considerate. Marlborough guests would not be disturbed. The Blenheim opened in 1906 with a Moorish dome, Spanish towers, and hot and cold running salt water in every room. Winston Churchill stayed there. The two hotels were joined by pedestrian bridges over Ohio Avenue and operated as the Marlborough-Blenheim, a single sprawling fantasia of a place. Across the street, Daniel White, Josiah's half-brother, owned the Traymore, which had started as a 10-room boarding house in 1879, named after the Maryland estate of its steadiest customer, a rich man everyone called Uncle Al Harvey, who had named his own estate after his hometown in Ireland. By 1898, the Traymore had grown to 450 rooms and was the city's largest hotel. But the Marlborough-Blenheim made it look old-fashioned. So in 1914, Daniel White hired the same architects, Price and McClanahan, to tear down the wooden Traymore and replace it with something that would dominate the skyline. The new Traymore rose 16 stories, tan brick with gold-capped towers, its wings jutting toward Pacific Avenue so that more rooms faced the ocean. It held 1,500 guests. Its ballroom held 4,000. Every bathtub had 4 faucets, hot and cold city water, hot and cold ocean water, and there was a 5th in the sink for ice water. People called it the Taj Mahal of Atlantic City, which is an irony that would take another 60 years to fully land. The Chalfonte Haddon Hall, operated by Quakers who did not allow alcohol, grew into the city's biggest property with nearly 1,000 rooms. The Claridge, the last of the great pre-casino hotels, opened in 1930 at 24 stories, built by a partnership that included the Philadelphia contractor John McShane. They called it the skyscraper by the sea, and the city called itself the world's playground. It was not just a slogan. By the 1920s, Atlantic City was attracting more visitors annually than the combined populations of New York City and Philadelphia. 99 trains a day pulled in and out during summer. The city supported 4 newspapers and 21 theaters. Broadway producers used it as a tryout town. If a show could play in Atlantic City, it could play anywhere. Convention Hall, completed in 1929 at a cost of $15 million, was the largest auditorium in the world, with a main hall that seated 41,000 and a pipe organ so enormous that it remains the largest in the world to this day, though much of it no longer functions. The place was not merely popular, it was inescapable. It had become part of the national vocabulary. When the most popular board game in American history needed a geography, it used Atlantic City's street names, Baltic and Mediterranean for the cheap properties, Boardwalk and Park Place for the expensive ones, the B&O Railroad, the Reading Railroad. Monopoly was a Depression-era game about money that let you handle large sums on a board shaped like Atlantic City's grid, and Americans took to it with something close to devotion. The Miss America pageant was born there in September 1921, invented by local businessmen as a scheme to extend the summer tourist season past Labor Day. They organized a small beauty contest and invited cities to send representatives. 7 came. The first winner was 16-year-old Margaret Gorman of Washington, D.C., who was crowned on the beach, awarded a golden mermaid statue, and photographed in a bathing suit. Still a mildly scandalous act in 1921. The pageant would be held in Atlantic City almost continuously for the next 8 decades, a fixture so embedded in the city's identity that losing it, when it eventually relocated, felt like losing a limb. But no account of Atlantic City in its peak years can avoid the man who, more than any architect or hotelier, defined what the city actually was during the Roaring '20s. Enoch Lewis Johnson, Nucky, was born in 1883 in Smithville, New Jersey, the son of the county sheriff, a man who had his own firm grip on local politics. Nucky graduated from Atlantic City High School in 1900, became undersheriff in 1905, was elected sheriff in 1908, and was appointed secretary of the Atlantic County Republican Executive Committee in 1909. When the previous boss, Louis the Commodore Quainley, was convicted of election fraud in 1911 and sent to prison, Nucky stepped into the vacuum with a smoothness that suggested the vacuum had been prepared. For the next 3 decades, Nucky Johnson ran Atlantic City. Not as mayor, he held the title of county treasurer, but as the boss of a political machine that controlled every significant decision in the city and the county. He was a large man, over 6 feet, and he wore a red carnation in the buttonhole of his suit every day. He lived at the Ritz-Carlton. He reportedly took a cut of every gallon of illegal liquor sold in Atlantic City and a percentage of every gambling and prostitution operation. His income was said to exceed $500,000 a year, the equivalent of $8 to $12 million today, depending on which year you index. He is supposed to have said, "We have whiskey, wine, women, song, and slot machines. I won't deny it, and I won't apologize for it. If the majority of the people didn't want them, they wouldn't be profitable, and they wouldn't exist." When Prohibition took effect in January 1920, it was essentially unenforced in Atlantic City. The city became a major East Coast port for smuggling liquor, and Nucky was its clearinghouse. Atlantic City's popularity surged precisely because it was one of the few places in America where a visitor could drink openly, gamble openly, and do more or less anything else that was technically illegal in the rest of the country. The city did not merely tolerate vice, it marketed it. The visitors came from Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Washington. They came because the trains were cheap and fast, and because Nucky Johnson had made sure the police would look the other way. In May 1929, Nucky hosted what became known as the Atlantic City Conference, a meeting of organized crime leaders from across the country. The details have been debated by historians for decades, and some scholars have questioned whether the gathering was as large or as consequential as later accounts made it seem. What is not disputed is that Al Capone was there, and that whatever was discussed over those few days in May, it took place in the hotels and on the boardwalk of a city whose political boss guaranteed there would be no interference from the law. A photograph exists, occasionally surfacing, of Capone, Lucky Luciano, and another mobster smiling in an indoor swimming pool. Atlantic City was a place where such photographs could be taken without worry. Nucky's era ended in 1941 when the federal government, after years of investigation, convicted him of tax evasion. He served 4 years in prison. When he came back to Atlantic City, he did not re-enter politics. He sold oil for a living. He died in 1968 in Northfield, New Jersey, still wearing the red carnation. But by the time Nucky went to prison, the city he had run was already being transformed into something no one had anticipated. In the summer of 1942, half a year after Pearl Harbor, the United States Army came to Atlantic City. 47 hotels on the boardwalk and the side streets were leased by the military and converted into barracks for Army Air Force Basic Training Center No. 7. The city became Camp Boardwalk, and it was the only town in the continental United States that was, in effect, turned entirely into a military base. Convention Hall became the Army Air Corps Technical Training Command Center. Haddon Hall became the Thomas England General Hospital, named for a lieutenant colonel who had worked with Walter Reed on yellow fever research, and it was, for a time, the largest hospital in the world. Over 300,000 soldiers passed through Atlantic City between 1942 and 1946. The boardwalk, smooth and flat and perfectly even, turned out to be ideal for amputees learning to walk on prosthetic legs. The military paid $1 a day per room. It was meager, but the Army guaranteed full occupancy every day, and for hotels that had been watching their bookings decline even before the war, it was a lifeline. The beaches closed at noon for calisthenics. Windows were covered with blue cellophane for the blackout. No girl under 18 was allowed on the boardwalk unescorted after 9 in the evening. Families invited soldiers to Sunday dinner. Bob Hope came to entertain the troops. So did the Andrews sisters, Abbott and Costello, Joe DiMaggio. The Miss America winners went on war bond tours. For a few years, Atlantic City felt purposeful in a way it never quite had before, as if the grand infrastructure built to entertain the nation could also serve the nation. The soldiers went home. The hotels reopened. And something had shifted that would take another decade to fully understand. The immediate post-war years still looked good if you didn't look too carefully. The nightclubs roared on. The 500 Club on the white South Side drew Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. On Kentucky Avenue, Club Harlem's Saturday shows started at 10 at night and did not end until Monday morning. Larry Steele's Smart Affairs Review, 40 to 50 acts, chorus girls, comedians, tap dancers, live jazz, grossed over $500,000 a year on a weekly production budget north of $35,000. Sammy Davis Jr.'s mother worked as a waitress at Grace's Little Belmont, a jazz lounge a few doors down. Whites came uptown to Club Harlem the way they had gone uptown to the Cotton Club in Harlem, to sit in the booths along the back wall and watch performers who were not allowed to stay in the boardwalk hotels where they might have headlined. The Kentucky Avenue scene was, in one of Atlantic City's more layered paradoxes, simultaneously a product of Jim Crow segregation and one of the most genuinely integrated spaces in mid-century America. The music did not care who was listening, but the forces assembling against Atlantic City were larger than any nightclub could counteract. The men who had trained at Camp Boardwalk had been exposed to beaches in Florida, California, the Pacific. Atlantic City's beach, in comparison, was cold, gray, and short-seasoned. Those same men came home to an America that was building interstate highways, spreading into suburbs, buying automobiles, and beginning to fly. In 1955, Disneyland opened in Anaheim, California. Suburban, controlled, designed, a different kind of American playground for a different kind of American family. Air conditioning made southern summers bearable. Cheap airfare put the Caribbean within reach. The forces that would hollow out Atlantic City were not local failures. They were national transformations. But Atlantic City, more dependent on big city tourism than any comparable resort, was positioned to lose bigger than most. The population peaked around 66,000 in 1930 and began a slow, barely perceptible decline. By 1960, it was below 50,000. By 1970, below 48,000. But the visitor numbers told the harsher story. The crowds thinned. The dress code on the boardwalk, once strictly enforced, once requiring that bathers use tunnels beneath the walk to reach the sand so as not to offend the promenaders, dissolved. By the 1960s, visitors wore cut-off shorts and sleeveless T-shirts. The old hotels, built for an era of long summer stays, could not compete with motels and motor lodges. The boardwalk's theaters went dark. The nightclubs on Kentucky Avenue, the North Side's legendary strip where Club Harlem had opened in 1935 and become the city's premier venue for black jazz performers, where Larry Steele's all-black revue Smart Affairs had run from 1946 to 1971 with 40 to 50 acts and a weekly budget exceeding $35,000, where Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra showed up to watch their contemporaries. Those clubs began to close as the city's entire ecosystem contracted. The racial dimension of Atlantic City's decline is essential and uncomfortable. The city had been deeply segregated. African Americans, who made up a large share of the workforce, the porters, maids, cooks, and waitstaff who kept the grand hotels running, were confined to the North Side neighborhood. They were allowed on only one stretch of beach, from Missouri to Ohio Avenue, a place later known as Chicken Bone Beach. As Jim Crow broke down in the 1950s and 1960s, as integration came to the hotels and the boardwalk, White middle-class visitors and residents left. This was not unique to Atlantic City. It was happening in cities across the Northeast. But in a city whose entire economy depended on attracting those visitors, the flight was devastating. The population loss, the crime increase, the drug epidemic, the tax base erosion, all of it accelerated in a feedback loop that by the early 1970s had made Atlantic City a case study in urban decline. And through it all, the Traymore stood at the corner of Illinois Avenue and the Boardwalk, its gold-capped towers increasingly absurd against the empty lots and boarded-up shops. In 1968, the owners spent $5 million on renovations, new elevators, air conditioning, a convention center addition, trying to stem the hemorrhaging. It was not enough. The hotel closed permanently in October 1971. On April 27, 1972, a demolition expert named Jacques Loiseau set off the first of 4 controlled implosions. By late May, the building that had held 1,500 guests, that had served as a military hospital, that had been called the Taj Mahal of Atlantic City, was a pile of rubble. It set a Guinness World Record for the largest controlled demolition. The site, at the Boardwalk and Illinois Avenue, became a vacant lot. It is still a vacant lot today. 4 years after the Traymore came down, the voters of New Jersey were asked whether to legalize casino gambling in Atlantic City. It was the second time they had been asked. In 1974, a statewide referendum had failed, defeated in 19 of 21 counties. On the Sunday before that vote, Methodist ministers across the state had warned their congregations about the evil of gambling. The second time, in November 1976, the referendum was limited to Atlantic City alone, and it passed by a margin of about 1.5 million to 1.14 million. The argument that carried the day was simple and transactional. Atlantic City was dying, and casinos were the only tool big enough to revive it. A company called Resorts International had seen it coming. Before the vote, Resorts had already purchased large tracts of Atlantic City real estate, including the historic Chalfonte Haddon Hall, the Quaker Hotel, the one that had been the Thomas England General Hospital, for $2.489 million. When the referendum passed, Resorts moved fast. They spent $11 million renovating the old hotel. On May 26, 1978, at 10 in the morning, Governor Brendan Byrne cut a ribbon, entertainer Steve Lawrence rolled the ceremonial first dice, and Resorts International opened as the first legal casino in the United States outside Nevada. People waited in line for hours on the boardwalk. The casino floor was 33,735 square feet, with 84 table games and 893 slot machines. It was open from 10 in the morning to 4 in the morning, and on weekends until 6. In its first month, the casino took in $16 million. Resorts company revenue jumped from $59 million in 1977 to $407 million in 1979. The company reported profits of $51 million for 1978 and $91 million for 1979. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it looked like the bet had paid off. Caesars opened in 1979, Bally's in 1979, the Sands in 1980, Harrah's in 1980, the Tropicana in 1981, Trump Plaza in 1984, Trump Marina in 1985, Showboat in 1987, and the biggest of them all, the Trump Taj Mahal, which opened on April 2, 1990, a building whose name was either an unconscious echo or a deliberate one-upmanship of the nickname people had once given the hotel that had been demolished on the same stretch of boardwalk to make room for the casino age. The Taj Mahal's construction budget had started at $250 million and ballooned to $930 million. Donald Trump, who controlled only 10% of the company by the end, would eventually sue to have his name removed from properties he no longer managed. The Marlborough-Blenheim, Price and McClanahan's concrete masterpiece, the Moorish Dome, the building that had been one of the first reinforced concrete structures in America, was demolished in 1979 to make way for Bally's. Josiah White's family, the Quakers who had built it and operated it for 3/4 of a century, accepted a purchase offer after the casino legislation passed. The dome came down, the hexagonal fireplaces, the creaking wooden floors, the sun gallery that had bridged Ohio Avenue, all of it was gone. The Dennis, the Shelburne, the Brighton, the Chelsea, the Breakers, the Mayflower, demolished in the 1970s and 1980s. Of all the grand pre-casino hotels that had lined the boardwalk, only the Claridge, the Dennis, absorbed into Bally's, the Ritz-Carlton, converted to condos, and Haddon Hall, now resorts, survived in any form. The Ambassador's steel frame was reused inside the Tropicana, but its distinctive brick facade was stripped away. The casinos brought money. That was never in question. At their peak, in 2006, Atlantic City's 12 casinos generated $5.2 billion in gambling revenue. They employed over 34,000 people directly and purchased over $1 billion in goods and services. But the money went into the casinos and, to a remarkable degree, stayed there. A local restaurant owner named Kugel saw his revenues cut in half after the first casino opened. By 1986, his restaurant was a parking lot. In 1978, there were 311 taverns and restaurants in Atlantic City. 19 years later, only 66 remained. The city's last movie theater closed in 1983. A wave of what locals called landlord lightning, suspicious fires, rolled through neighborhoods adjacent to the casinos, as properties that had been worth modest rents as housing were suddenly worth more as potential parking lots. Small businesses disappeared. Vacant land multiplied. Foot traffic outside the casino corridors evaporated. The promise had been that casinos would be a unique tool of urban development. The referendum campaign had explicitly pitched gambling as a way to rebuild the city, not just the boardwalk, but the neighborhoods, the schools, the infrastructure. A tax on casino revenue would fund programs for the elderly and disabled across the state. Investment would ripple outward from the gaming floors into shops and restaurants and housing. The reality was that the casinos were fortresses. You walked in from the boardwalk, you gambled, you ate at the casino restaurant, you slept in the casino hotel, and you left. The city outside the fortress walls continued to decay. Population kept falling. Below 41,000 by 2000, below 40,000 by 2010, below 39,000 by 2020. The median household income, as of the 2006 to 2010 census survey, was $30,237. More than a quarter of the population lived below the poverty line. Over a third of children. Atlantic City remained a city without a full-scale supermarket or a department store. And then the fortresses themselves began to fall. The problem was the same problem it had always been, the same problem Dr. Pitney's railroad had both solved and created. Atlantic City had only one thing to sell, and when competitors showed up, the customers had choices. In 2004, Pennsylvania legalized casino gambling. Casinos opened in Philadelphia and the Poconos and Bethlehem, closer to the population centers that had been driving 2 hours to Atlantic City. Maryland followed, New York followed, Delaware followed. Connecticut had Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun. The Atlantic City gamblers' 2-hour drive became unnecessary when there was a casino 40 minutes away. Casino revenue in Atlantic City peaked at $5.2 billion in 2006 and began falling immediately. It fell every single year from 2007 through 2016, a decade of unbroken decline. By 2013, revenue had dropped to $2.86 billion, a decline of 45% in 7 years. A Moody's analyst named Peggy Holloway put it plainly. The decline predated the recession, and it was a function of two things: a failure to reinvest in the properties themselves and the arrival of casinos in neighboring states. In 2014, the reckoning arrived all at once. 4 casinos closed in a single year. The Atlantic Club in January, the Showboat in August, Revel on September 2nd, and Trump Plaza on September 16th. Almost 8,000 people lost their jobs. The mass unemployment filing at the Atlantic City Convention Center, where more than 100 workstations were set up to process the newly jobless dealers and cocktail servers, was the most visible single manifestation of the collapse. The Revel was the cruelest symbol. It had cost $2.4 billion to build, the most expensive casino ever constructed in Atlantic City. And it was supposed to be the city's future, a seaside pleasure palace that happened to have a casino, aimed at a younger, more sophisticated clientele who would come for the spa and the restaurants and the views and might, incidentally, gamble. It was the anti-casino casino. It opened in April 2012. It ran out of money halfway through construction and had to abandon plans for a second hotel tower while scrambling for the remaining $1 billion needed to finish the first. It went bankrupt twice. It closed 2 years and 5 months after it opened. It had banned smoking, which alienated gamblers. It had no buffet, which alienated bus trip tourists. It had charged high room rates, which alienated everyone else. At $2.4 billion, it closed for less than a nickel on the dollar. Its tower, the second tallest building in New Jersey, stood dark on the boardwalk, a monument to a bet that did not pay. There is a photograph from that era, widely circulated, of an elderly woman walking alone on the boardwalk past the blank, dark facade of a closed casino. It could be any of them. The names change: Trump, Revel, Showboat, but the image is the same. A person on a boardwalk, passing a building that was supposed to save everything. 9 casinos remain open today. Combined with online gambling and sports betting, legalized in New Jersey in 2013 and 2018 respectively, the total gaming revenue is partially recovered, reaching $4.7 billion in 2022. The Borgata, which opened in 2003 in the Marina District away from the boardwalk, has been the city's highest-grossing casino for years. The Revel was eventually sold and reopened as the Ocean Casino Resort. Some blocks have seen new investment. There are efforts, always efforts, to diversify away from gambling, to attract families, to rebuild the non-casino economy. The boardwalk is still 5.5 miles long, and on a good summer weekend, still draws hundreds of thousands of people. But here is the thing about Atlantic City, the thing that makes it unlike any other city in America. It was invented, not settled, not grown organically from a river crossing or a natural harbor or a mine, invented. Pitney invented it. Osborne drew it on a map and gave it a name designed to sound grander than the mosquito-ridden sandbar it actually was. The railroad made it real. And because it was invented for a single purpose, to attract visitors, it has lived and nearly died by that purpose 3 times over. The first time was the original resort era, which peaked in the 1920s and collapsed after World War II, when Americans discovered they could vacation elsewhere. The second was the casino era, which peaked in 2006 and collapsed when neighboring states realized they could keep the gambling dollars at home. The third, whatever it turns out to be, is happening now, and nobody is certain what the draw is supposed to be this time. Each time, the pattern was the same. Atlantic City had a monopoly on seaside resort access by rail, then on legal East Coast gambling, and the monopoly generated staggering revenue, and the revenue attracted investment, and the investment created a skyline, and then the monopoly broke. The railroad monopoly broke when cars and airplanes let people go elsewhere. The casino monopoly broke when Pennsylvania and the other states legalized gambling, and each time the monopoly broke, Atlantic City discovered that it had not built a city. It had built a toll booth. The infrastructure, the hotels, the boardwalk, the casinos, existed to extract revenue from people passing through. When those people found another route, there was nothing underneath to sustain the place. No diversified economy, no major employer that was not tourism dependent, no reason for someone to live there except to service the visitors. That is the particular cruelty of a company town where the company is a season. The Traymore site is still a vacant lot at the corner of Illinois Avenue and the boardwalk. If you stand there on a summer evening, you can see the casino towers to the north and south, lit up in colors the old hoteliers never imagined. Behind you, a block or 2 inland, there are streets that look like they belong to a different city entirely. Pawn shops and check-cashing storefronts and houses with plywood over the windows. The boardwalk beneath your feet is laid in a herringbone pattern, the same pattern Alexander Boardman chose in 1870 to give a smoother ride to the rolling chairs. The wood has been replaced many times. The pattern has not. On the Monopoly board, the most expensive property is Boardwalk. The second most expensive is Park Place. You can buy both for $750 in play money. In the real Atlantic City, the Marlborough-Blenheim stood at Park Place and the boardwalk, probably the most valuable corner on the board, and certainly one of the most valuable corners of real estate in the city's history. Josiah White built it. Price and McClanahan designed it. Reinforced concrete, the material of the future, was poured into Moorish forms in 1905 and 1906. The building stood for 73 years. Then it was demolished to make way for a casino that still operates under a different name on that same lot, and the hexagonal fireplaces that once warmed the lobby are gone, and the sun gallery that crossed Ohio Avenue is gone, and the dome is gone. Dr. Pitney wanted to build a health resort. He believed that salt water was medicine, that ocean air cured the diseases that festered in the industrial cities, that if you could just get people to the island itself would do the rest. He was wrong about the medicine, but right about the impulse. People wanted to come. For over a century, they kept coming, by train, by car, by bus, by the millions. They came for the air, and then for the spectacle, and then for the gambling. And the city rebuilt itself each time around whatever was bringing them in, tearing down what had brought the last wave to make room for what would bring the next. At the corner of North Carolina Avenue and the Boardwalk, the building that was once the Chalfonte Haddon Hall, the Quaker Hotel where no liquor was served, the wartime hospital where amputees learned to walk again, is now Resorts Casino Hotel, Atlantic City's oldest casino, still open, still taking bets. Somewhere inside its walls are the bones of a structure that was first built in 1868, when a woman named Elisha Roberts bought the lot from a man named John DaCosta for $6,500. The building has been a rooming house, a grand hotel, a military hospital, a casino. It has been renamed and renovated and expanded and partially demolished and rebuilt so many times that it is difficult to say what, if anything, of the original remains. The Absecon Lighthouse, the one Pitney lobbied Congress to build after watching too many ships break apart in the Graveyard Inlet, still stands in the inlet section of the city. When it was built in 1854, it was at the edge of the ocean. It is now more than half a mile from the beach. The island has grown. The lighthouse has not moved. The distance between them is the measure of everything that has been added: sand, concrete, ambition, money, to a place that started as a doctor's hunch and a railroad to nowhere.